Hello there, my name's George English. I'm the Director of Research Through People. Welcome to this podcast. And today we're going to be talking to Sue Webber, who had ancestors who emigrated from Britain to America 100 years ago. And I've been researching them back in time, and we're going to discuss them with her. And there are quite a few surprises, I tell you. So Sue, why don't you introduce yourself?
Well, I am the one and only Sue Webber, originally from Wilton, Connecticut, and later in life moved to the Annapolis, Maryland area. Um, I have always dreamed of digging into my family history, and uh, thank goodness my paths crossed with George so that he was able to help me navigate through a few hurdles right out of the gate. And they were frustrating to the point where I actually put down my pen and walked away for several months, if not a year or two or three. But yeah, George helped me re-spark that fire and help me get through it. And I definitely learned a lot, not only about family names and fascinating facts, but about how life was actually lived during these time frames and what was acceptable and what wasn't, and just very, very different. So thank you, George.
It's good. And a couple of things there. One is you talk about Maryland and places, etc. You know, most Britons wouldn't know a lot about that, perhaps, and possibly that's the same with yourself. I mean, what did you know about your ancestors when you started?
Um, so right now, what you've helped me with is my father's mother and that line. And she didn't speak much about it. She spoke about her two sisters, one more than the other. And then later on, her stepbrother came over, but I didn't really understand what a stepbrother was, I guess. She never talked about her mother or her father. Um, I do remember hearing something about the Queen of England. Um, I I almost think like someone worked for her, but she was in the storytelling. Um, but my grandmother was extremely hardworking, and I wish I had asked a lot more questions when I had the opportunity to get the answers right from the horse's mouth. It certainly would have helped me avoid some headaches.
And I guess that's quite a common story. You know, a certain amount. There are things you got hints at or what have you. Most people wish they'd asked more when they had the chance, etc. So your
Absolutely.
grandmother Blanche was the one who actually left England 1914, just before the First World War. So we're talking about 100 years or so ago. So I put one or two slides together so to say a couple of things, but actually just a prompt between us conversation. Um, and
So we didn't really know her as Blanche.
aha,
I actually learned that. Uh, I'm sure I heard it, but it just never stuck with me. We always knew her as Daisy.
yeah,
And due to
aha,
her second marriage, we called her Mommy M for Meyer.
yeah. So can you see that screen?
I cannot.
All right, we need to. We can just once I master the
There
technology.
you go. There's Mommy M.
Yeah, and again, is it interesting? In fact, one of the things I wish I could go and talk to people. So don't do that because it's Blanche. Her first name was Daisy, wasn't she?
Yes.
Daisy Blanche. And then you come across a record Blanche, and you think, can this be the same person? And then it's interesting as a child, you have pet names and things that come up. So that's your grandparents. Yes, that's Blanche and
Yes.
the
Yes.
website we're not touching today, but again, there's a very interesting story for that. So what I thought I'd do is just start off with, we'll set the scene again, picking up what you were saying about Maryland and so on. So here we have England, Scotland, Wales. There are various counties. Down the bottom right there, we've got London, which of course is the predominant city. And then there are various counties around the place. And of course, one of the interesting things is, where did our ancestors come from? And I like the expression, they lived through history. Now, a couple of big things that have happened in Britain over the last centuries are firstly the Industrial Revolution, starting in the 1700s. And basically before then, most people stayed in the same area, tended to work on farms and so on and so forth. And then this Industrial Revolution exploded literally in Britain. Britain led the world. And so lots of people left their country residency and went to the towns and cities where the new industries were. And that had a tremendous effect on where people lived and the records about them. Other big thing that's happened over the centuries is Britain in particular went round to the world, went to America and various other places, and people emigrated. And so again, you find people who were living in Britain at one point and then they go, and like your ancestor, 100 or so years ago, she left here and went somewhere else. And of course, someone like yourself is interested. Oh, I wonder what it was like, where they were from, what happened, and so on and so forth. So we'll touch on that. And where did your ancestors come from? So I've just highlighted those counties where I've found records. And there are two particular surnames, you mentioned them already, Bowler, William Bowler, and Emma Kelson. So those two surnames we talk about. The Bowlers were in the London area, typically south of the Thames, and we talk more about that. Now, what's really intriguing here, as you know, the county of Kent, I grew up in a place called Sevenoaks.
Mhm.
And someone called Sue Webber has got ancestors who lived in Sevenoaks way before I was born. So actually, we could talk about places that I knew growing up, and we'll come back to that. The Kelsons particularly came from the Somerset area, a bit further west, and quite a different story. And again, we'll talk about that. Now, I've just at the top there, see Cumbria, or Cumberland as it was. There's one ancestor who actually came from there. Whether it's Industrial Revolution or not, I don't know, but that's a lot of people. So if people living in the London area, they may have come from all over. My ancestors were Cockneys from London, and I've got a graph like this with people living in various places, but at the appropriate time coming down to London. So we'll see how that story plays out in your case. The other thing I wanted to just sort of talk about is, in researching and finding out, obviously what I want to particularly do is find records that are reliable, that tell us stories. And there are four particular factors that affect that. Whether the record was recorded, has it survived, and can we find it? The status. Now, if you were royalty or a monarchy or a landowner, much more likely that records would be kept than if you weren't. But then records were kept particularly for professions and trades employees. Passengers, interesting between America and Britain, passenger lists have become much more available of late. And in your case, again, we found passenger lists. But even at the bottom of the pile, so to speak, the workhouse where the poor went, they kept records. If we can find them, we can find out about the people. What sort of records? Well, the most obvious ones are the birth, marriage, and death records, which in England started in 1837. So going back that far in early 1800s is much easier than beforehand, when there weren't so many records. And a very key document is the census. Every 10 years, the whole family was recorded. So you know, that is their parents. Of course, their ages, where they were born, what the occupations were, a very useful document. Before then, it tended to be church parish registers. When they baptized a child, they would record that and so on. And then there's all sorts of other records, wills, gravestones, and so on. Names, clearly it's much easier to find a name if it's unusual. First name, so there are certain traditions in these sort of things. So we'll see, you've got one or two quite unusual names, one or two quite common ones. And continuity, clearly if the records, the person lived in the same place, much easier to find than if they moved around a lot, although with the internet, it's becoming easier and easier to do that. So what I thought I'd do is start with really where you started. Your great-grandmother, Emma Kelson, now found out that she was born in Camden Town, which is in London now, we would say, but just near the River Thames, and we talk about the Thames quite a lot. And then Rotherhithe, she dies just south of the River Thames. And you told me this interesting story, which is quite unusual, that she had 3 sets of children and 3 different men killed William. And what are the odds against that? But she married the first one, William Wilkinson, They had 2 children. Now, there was a big sushi about a will that, again, you knew quite a lot about, but they broke up, kicked him out, and then in relationships with these 2 other men. You said, I can't find any records of them being married. I haven't been able to find either. So one thinks they probably just lived together, but they did live together. So here are these 3 men in her life, and we'll talk about that. William Bowler is your ancestor, so we'll particularly look at the Bowlers. And so here's Blanche or Daisy Bowler. So she's born 1892, and so 1914, so in her 20s, she goes across to America. And as you know, she lives in New York and dies there. And your great-grandmother, we just mentioned, there we are, that she's born 1866. So we're talking about 150 years ago or something. And there's a photo, which, again, very often the families have photos of the recent people, which, of course, is great in bringing them to life. So we look at the Bowlers. I'll quickly put down where we've got to here. So William Bowler. So he's born in Rotherhithe. His dad's born in Bermondsey, pretty close to each other on the south side of the river. Anne Pringle, his mother's, born in Carlisle in Cumberland, other end of the country. Different story there. And this goes back into the 18th century. So let's have a look at trying to bring this to life a bit. And before I do that, let's I've been in the Kelson. I'm going to come back to the Kelsons, but they're already mentioned. George Kelson lived in Sevenoaks, where I lived in. And basically, he married, had a number of kids with Charlotte Rich. And then she died, and he remarried Mary Ellis, who, again, Mary Ellis is your ancestor. And there's a whole story there. The Ellises, her dad came from London. On the Kelson side, there's some quite interesting families. There's the Whitmores. Now, Gloucestershire is near Somerset. To throw this in, Thomas Kirkwood, I've abbreviated Somerset there, but he's born in the mid-1700s in this place, Beckington in Somerset. So we'll return to them in a moment. And you can see going back in time. So what I thought I would do is, what I find interesting is, are you interested in coming over sometime and
Absolutely. My son and I plan to come in the spring of 2025 in April or May.
Excellent. Well, I like the
Absolutely.
expression walking in your ancestors' footsteps, and that's absolutely great. And to an extent, and you've been to Britain before, haven't you?
Yes.
And when was the last time?
Oh, like 1991,
Right,
92.
30 years or so. But you've come, and
Yeah.
particularly, I don't know if your son's been, but there's a tourist element, isn't there? That if you come to London, it'd be a shame not to see things. So I've got London here, and there's the River Thames, and here are famous places you've probably heard of: St Paul's Cathedral, the Tower of London, the River Thames, the City of London. And one of the interesting things, our ancestors lived through time over the centuries, and it changes. So London was, for a long time, the City of London, and you can see the outline of the City of London there. They talk about the square mile. It's literally that sort of size. And the Mayflower, it actually left from Rotherhithe, which is where our ancestors came from. Now, that's 400 years ago. The population of London then was about 80,000 people. It's now millions, of course. Things have grown. But there are these places, there's Buckingham Palace down there and Big Ben. But when people are talking about London going back in the past, it's quite important to know, are we talking about the City of London or wider than that? And sorry, I need to go back, sorry. Yes, so I put Bermondsey and Rotherhithe. So your ancestors mostly lived on the south side of the River Thames. River Thames had a very big impact in all sorts of ways, etc. But clearly, if you were coming to London, you would want to see the tourist places as well as your ancestors lived. And there's some quite interesting aspects to that. So I've got an old print here of London. And Industrial Revolution, it's amazing. You can see in the 19th century, the population went from 1 million to 7 million. It just exploded. And then it had all sorts of impacts, all sorts of positive impacts. The City of London became the financial centre of the world and so on. But with that growth of population, there was tremendous pressure on accommodation or lack of it. Slums grew up and so on, particularly in the east end of London. Now, this is actually looking to the west down the River Thames. You can see there's the St. Paul's Cathedral. This is the City of London on the north side of the river, the south. Now, your ancestors mainly lived on the south side, Bermondsey and Rotherhithe. There was a very big fish market called the Billingsgate Fish Market, which was just on the north of the Thames, and we find your ancestors lived quite near there. And here's a sort of more a map of the parishes, so to speak. So you can see Bermondsey is quite a large area south of the Thames, Rotherhithe, and there's the City of London and various other places that you may or may not be familiar with. But if you go back here, we've got the places, Rotherhithe and Bermondsey, where they live. Now, what do? William Bowler was a publican. So he actually had a pub just on the north side of the river near this Billingsgate that I've mentioned. His son went into the same sort of business. A licensed victualler was someone who sold alcohol and so forth. And then lighterman, we've discussed this before, haven't we? You get these old occupations and you can be easily misled, because I think you, not Annette, thought he was someone who lit street lights.
Candles, right.
But a lighter was in fact a type of barge, a ship that was used on the River Thames to move cargo around, really, take it off a ship and move it to the land and all the rest of it. So he actually worked on a ship. And what I found a fascinating thing is your dad was quite keen on sailing, wasn't he?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, very much so.
So perhaps it runs in the family. So there's stuff. So let's have a look at this in a bit more detail. So they lived in an area called St Mary at Hill. There's some strange names from the past, just on the north side of the river, actually in the City of London. And here's a sort of black and white photo from 100 years ago or something. Now, the pub he had was actually in Dark House Lane. And I came across this old print from about 1870 or 1880, Billingsgate Fish Market. Look at these fish. Look at the conditions. I mean, slum is one term, etc. But, working conditions and so on. I bet they were glad when they got to his pub and had a drink or what have you.
Yeah.
Trying to visualize what things are like for our ancestors is what I find it fascinating. And if I could bring them to life for you, then that helps. So again, you've got the shape narrowing of the Thames. So there we are. There's the Thames. Here, the City of London is just on the north here. There's St Mary at Hill and Billingsgate Market. It's actually moved further east, but it was there. And one thing I do is I plot where I find the various family members living on a map like this. So you could see, we don't need to go into the detail, but there's Bermondsey, there's Rotherhithe, and here are various places where they lived. So if you come over, great to go to these places. Now, of course, very often the houses has been knocked down with developments and so on and so forth. So it's intriguing to see whether one can actually find the places that they live still there. But nevertheless, that you'll be able to go to these places and you'll be able to get a feeling for where they're from. Now, any comments on that? We're going to move on from there.
No.
So there's the bowlers as such. Now, going back in time, you mentioned Sevenoaks. Now, I grew up there, but I didn't know. If you visit, here's a photo. So looking down the right-hand side here, this is the High Street of Sevenoaks. And looking down the left here is London Road. And one reason that Sevenoaks grew and developed many centuries ago was because of this junction of main thoroughfares. So the road coming from London, obviously quite a busy London road. The one High Street goes up to the north of Kent, and this is where it joined. And your ancestors lived in various places. Now, what's particularly intriguing for me is my dad took me to the bank when I was at age 15 and opened an account for me at the address where your ancestor lived in about 1860 or something. In fact, it wasn't the same building, but it's just literally, that's the building there in that West Bank. Over here was my favorite toy shop. And your ancestor lived next door to that. And married later in life someone who lived about 4 houses down the road. And here again, I've done that. So this is Sevenoaks. So that photo was taken up here, looking down the High Street and London Road. And there are numbers there where the ancestors lived. Quite a useful thing about the sort of aerial photo is get a bit more perspective. And St Nicholas Church crops up in your thing, that you can see it's there. Now,
Yep.
the Red House, if you've heard of Jane Austen, the novelist,
Yes.
she had, I think it was her uncle lived in the Red House in Sevenoaks, and your ancestor was a doctor
Yes.
and actually treated Jane Austen.
Ah,
Another thing, looking up from there, you can see to the right here, Knowle Park, Knowle House. Now, particularly when I was growing up, we used to love going to Knowle Park, but there's this enormous house owned by a noble family, had 365 rooms. And Knowle Park was amazing. You could see there's a golf course there. We used to play our sports there, etc., etc. So there's this enormous sort of resource, if you like, to Sevenoaks. Cricket, I don't think you Americans play very much cricket.
no.
But the Sevenoaks Rhine Cricket Club is one of the oldest cricket clubs in the world. And I used to play there as a kid. But again, you can come and you can see these various places. So you knew about Sevenoaks beforehand, I think, did you not?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, Sevenoaks is exactly what it means. There were 7 oaks there. Funny, in different parts of the country, how different naming things grew up. But in Kent, it was quite common, though. Quite near Sevenoaks was 4 elms and 5 ash. So imagine, centuries ago, there just being 7 oak trees, and that's what got the name going, etc. So that was the Kelsons, and quite a big story in the Kelsons. Now, again, I found a black and white photo of this is down the high street from where we were looking beforehand, and you can see rather than cars, there are horse and carts. And quite interestingly for me, I remember some places more like this than the way they are 50 years after I left. But so let's go to the family itself. So here we are. We have George Kelson. Now, he was a doctor. So he married Charlotte Rich, had 7 or 8 children, and then she dies. You can see 17 years after they're married. And eventually he marries Mary Ellis, who was literally from just down the road in Sevenoaks. Almost certainly Mary would have known him when she was growing up. You can see she's just 20 when they marry. And say, actually, Mary is your ancestor. Now, her dad came down from London, and we mentioned earlier on this story that there was a will, and one of the sons of George and Charlotte managed to get Mary's 2 children cut out of the will. And in fact, there are documents of a massive page in the Kew records in London. And well, we can go. And we'll come, because in fact, one of the things we managed to do is find a living relative of yours, haven't we, Kevin Kelson? And that relative had done a lot of work and got a lot of information on this. So I'm just going to put in the Kelsons. What's interesting, they clearly were well-to-do people in the past. They're from Somerset down to the west. Anne Whitmore, she's from Gloucestershire, just next to Somerset. And we've traced their family back to the 17th century. I expect to get back 200 years unless there are problems. It's great when we can get back 300 or more years. And in the case of the Kelsons, again, there we are in Somerset, this place, Beckington. Midsummer Norton's a well-known name, a lot of people. And the Mortimer family were well-to-do as well. But there we are going back into the 17th century. Now, here's again a map of where so Bath is a place well known, etc., a lovely old city, and so they live quite close to that. There's some great names. I think I mentioned to you. I was quite amused when I found White Ox Mead. That's where they lived. Now, what's interesting with going back in time, you'll have heard William the Conqueror came to England in 1066, and the French took England. Anyway. In 1087, they had what they called the Domesday Book. They literally went round and made a note of all the properties and who owned them. And the White Ox Mead is in the Domesday Book, so more than 1,000 years ago. We have got records back to that far with the Kelsons. I, at this point, couldn't say for certain they're absolutely totally reliable, but there's quite a good chance because a well-to-do family with property and various other things, records were kept for that. And here we are. There's William Kelson. Here is where he lived in Midsummer Norton. Lovely old property.
Mm-hmm.
So you haven't been down to Somerset?
No.
I know you're looking forward to going, aren't you?
Definitely.
Good. And then on the Mortimer side, here we have Beckington Castle. So we're talking about, really well-to-do families going back in time, but back in history. So I just sort of do that flavor. So over to you. Comments, reactions?
I'm just thrilled and fascinated by all of it. Even I can't thank you enough for getting me through the hurdle with Amelia Kelson. And then the whole scandal about being left out of the will, and then her stepbrother, the lawyer, orchestrating all that, but then her stepsister paying the legal fees to help her regain some of that with her brother. So that was just all interesting. When I get over there, that I'm definitely going to Amelia's grave. I need to have a little chat with her. She really put up the hurdles. But again, thank you for helping me get through it, because I know I wouldn't have been able to do it without you. Going through the records, I did enjoy the census and learning what the occupations were. I had to Google a lot of the definitions, and how the record keepers would notate names phonetically, and like Joseph, instead of the PH, it would just be an F. And then you get a little scared. Do you accept documents that have the PH and not the F? And then how some of the ancestors actually changed the last names down the line. And then how names were constantly repeated. My goodness. And we have family that certainly had a lot of children. Some would have 12 or 14 children. Woo. And I don't know how they did it back then. I only have one, and I know I couldn't do it with multiple kids.
Well, you're touching on a sign of the times. Children died then, so they tended to have big families because of that happening. I
You're
mean, I had
right.
an ancestor, and we found that we thought they had 8 children at one time, and 3 died before the age of 1. And then we found someone who had the family Bible. They had 13 children. 7 died before the age of 1. I mean,
Oh,
how does a mother cope with that? But that was reality,
right.
unfortunately.
And they were much stronger individuals, living through hardships. And even though our family seems to be very well-to-do, it's still, that whole part of it would be really hard.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that, we say religion was strong. I think there was, a belief
Yes.
in God, if God wills it, and so on. Because how do you get through that? It's unbelievable.
Finding the supporting detail, and just the stories and how it all comes together. I think it's so fascinating. I wish more and more people would take the opportunity to dive in deep and find out the history of their family, and then share it with others. But it doesn't seem that many people are very interested in it.
I think it's a question of, as you get more interested, you build and so on. And it's lovely for me to hear someone like you say that sort of thing, which
Well, it's fun though. And then meeting Kevin Kelson and seeing what he was able to put together, and the tree that you helped me to develop is different from his in some respects. I think ours is right versus his, but, I can't spend any time trying to prove that. But it just goes on and on and on. So.
Yeah. That's probably
I,
quite a good point just to wind this conversation up as such. That clearly we'll be in touch. But for anyone who's watching this, that I think hopefully they found it interesting, and I think that's quite an interesting point to end on, etc. And so thank you to anyone who is watching. If you do like it, then please subscribe to the Research Through People channel, as it really helps the channel to grow and spread the message, picking up the point that you made, Sue. And we will be in touch, won't we?
Great. Thanks, George.